Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Our guest on this episode of the podcast is Romulo Lollato, K-State Extension Wheat and Forage Production Specialist. Wheat, or Triticum estivum, provides approximately 21% of the world's food and protein. The role that wheat plays in global food security is unquestioned, but what about wheat's role in a sustainable cropping system? There is more value to winter wheat than the price received for the grain, and now a study has been done to analyze wheat beyond the value of the grain. So Kansas Wheat is proud to announce that we are collaborating with K-State to present a campaign to explain the added value of wheat to our different audiences. On this episode of the podcast, we are kicking off that campaign with an introduction and discussion about the versatility of winter wheat. So I can think of no better person to lead this campaign than Dr. Lollato. So Romulo, tell us about the beginnings of wheat beyond the value of the grain. We've been talking about this for a long time. Tell us the process about how you went about actually doing a research publication on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Aaron, thanks for having me here again. It's always great to be here and share some of our thoughts with the Wheats on Your Mind podcast listeners. This is all I can think back. It began back in the winter of that 2019 to 2020, just before the pandemic. I guess everybody kind of remembers that as a mark, right? But I was driving back from the Wheat Quality Council meeting that we had in Kansas City, and I was on the phone with you. We were chatting. Then we had this idea, right? Because the main thing that we're trying to address here, we're concerned with a reduction in wheat area in the States, right? If we look at the entire country, wheat area had been going down, now probably dating back to 1990 or so, and we put some numbers on that, about 865,000 acres a year. That's over 1%. It's about 1.3% per year in terms of area reduction in wheat out there in the States. And unfortunately, if we zoom in Kansas, that goes up to 1.9, so almost 2% per year that wheat area has been going down here in the States, here in Kansas, right? And so the rationale there is, okay, well, growers are switching from wheat to other crops, perhaps crops that in that season may be more profitable, soybeans or corn, right? Primarily driving that switch in area. But wheat as a crop, it brings many benefits to that cropping system, right? And so our concern there is kind of twofold. One, in areas such as Kansas, where wheat historically has been an important crop, by switching out of it, we may be missing out in some of those benefits that maybe have made our cropping systems here successful because of those added benefits that wheat has to the crop rotation. And then beyond Kansas, if we look at areas where perhaps wheat has not been significantly throughout history, think of the Corn Belt or so, right? Iowa and other states where corn and soybeans are typically their main primary crops. Maybe they're also missing out on potential benefits that wheat could bring to those cropping systems. So it's kind of like a twofold, right? Where wheat has historically been important, we know of the importance of it, but perhaps we hadn't at that point in time done the effort of compiling all of that into a single idea, a single document there, right? So back then in that February 2020, it was one kind of things that started here. We had a student on board, Luana Simão, who had just started her Ph.D. and we said, well, we couldn't think of a better project for her to have as part of her dissertation in terms of just going back and reviewing many studies that have been published over the years, not only looking at wheat grain, but also at the wheat benefits to the cropping system.
You know, those benefits to the cropping system, I think we all know about it, right? Well, farmers are aware of it. They've seen that. And, you know, there are different audiences, though. We talk about maybe absentee landlords, maybe the banks who's giving the farmer the loan, you know, what the value is, why farmers keep wheat in the rotation, because it's certainly not necessarily the most profitable crop in that rotation. So Luana did this research and accumulated all of this, and what we're going to do is kind of break it down into segments, that paper, and talk about those values that we can now quantify a little bit and add that to the whole picture. So on This episode, we're going to focus today a little bit on the versatility of winter wheat in a cropping system. And we don't talk about that cropping system enough. I think, a lot of research focuses on the individual crops, but the focus on that entire cropping system. So let's just start with the versatility of winter wheat. And I think one of the first things that comes to mind is that with winter wheat, you've got such a broad planting window that you have available to you.
Yeah, wheat definitely brings a lot of versatility on the farm, right? And very briefly, before we jump into that, I will mention that it was taking her a little bit long to get me that work done, right? And I was wondering, okay, what's going on? But when she brought it only had over 60 pages.
Right. Yeah.
Of benefits that wheat brings to the cropping system. Yeah. So in that 60 pages, like if you put all the references that she had out there, over 300 studies that she accumulated across all those different benefits, then it went over 80 plus pages, right? But with all those, just as written content, she brought me over 60 pages of benefits that wheat brings to the cropping system. And also, it's important to remind the readers here, it's a book chapter. It's published out there. Mm-hmm. If anybody's interested, we're happy to share. But we are bringing that as a more digestible, small 2-page extension type of publications here during this campaign, right? So be on the lookout for that. Those 2 pages, they're going to be coming out here during this winter. And so, again, just summarizing all that information.
And they are part of the bigger Wheat RX program that we're doing with Kansas Wheat and K-State too. So, yeah, that's part of that. But the whole paper itself is worth reading if people want to do that, and maybe we can connect people with that later.
Absolutely. But okay, so thinking about wheat as a versatile crop, right? So what makes wheat a versatile crop? In particular, winter wheat, right? It's not the case perhaps it's not the case for spring wheat, but let's focus here where we are in Kansas in the winter wheat growing region of the U.S., right? If we think of when yield is determined in the winter wheat crop, it really is a fairly short window compared to the entire cycle, right? We plant the crop there depending from September all the way to November. It needs to grow up a little bit there before the fall, just so enough so it has some winter hardness to it, and then it makes through the winter. And all of that point, we're not necessarily yet determining our yield of the crop. Now, when the crop starts to get into green up after the winter and starts to get to what we call first hollow stem, that means that little developing head is getting to the ground level, starts to develop in the crown, starts to move up. That's what we call critical period for yield determination. That's when it starts, right? In that window, close to jointing through about flowering. That's when we're going to determine the potential number of grains out there. And then from flowering through grain filling period, that's when we determine grain weight. So the two things that give our yield, grain number and grain weight. So the grain number potential determined in that window there from jointing through about flowering, and then grain weight from flowering onwards through grain filling. So if we think of the entire crop cycle, that's a fairly small window there compared to a crop that is out there 9 or 10 months out of the year. We're talking about a couple of months that are really important for yield determination. Because it's such a small period as compared to the entire cycle, it does give us a lot of flexibility in the remaining of the cycle, right? So that's where the versatility comes in, is that there's a lot of things that we can do to the crop early on that it doesn't necessarily impact yield, or it impacts yield to a lower extent than some other crops, such as summer crops, where it's more straightforward, right? You plant, it gets going, it grows due to temperature, and yields determined right then. So one of the versatility that it brings to the farm is on planting dates. As you mentioned before, right, in terms of planting dates here, I think it's important for us to always bring this into comparison, right, with summer crops, but not only that, also to put in perspective from a geographical perspective, because things change a lot depending where we are in Kansas, right? So let's start with summer crops. Many times we have a planting window that starts there mid-April through late April, mid-May. And if you're delaying your planting since then, you're losing yield potential in fraction of bushels per acre per day for every day that you're delaying your planting. In terms of wheat, it's not necessarily such a steep decline like that. In particular, if we think of south central Kansas and going into Oklahoma and Texas, right, kind of in the southern part of the winter wheat growing region here, instead it's more of a curve think of like a curve where your yield potential, it increases in time until it reaches an optimum, and then it starts kind of going down as we are delaying our yield potential. Now, that curve can be pretty steep, depending where we are, but it can be also fairly flat, right? So let's give an example where it's pretty steep and then the versatility may not apply as much. These will be regions where it gets cold fairly soon in the fall. Think of northwest Kansas, northeast Colorado, and north from there, right? Regions where in the fall, say that if they miss that optimum planting date, which will be about September 25th or around that time, and starts getting into October 5th, October 10th, well, we're losing yield potential there because it gets cold fairly soon. The wheat doesn't have as much time to tiller in the fall, and so we are compromising our yield potential if we're delaying planting date there. Now, we have evaluated data from thousands and thousands of observations in Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and other regions, looking at planting date and wheat yield. And what we see is that if we look at south central Kansas going into Oklahoma, all the way to the southern part of Oklahoma, and even parts of southwest Kansas as well, because temperatures do not get cold as quickly in the fall, that planting window is much wider, right? We might have up to 50, 60 days where we might be able to reach our yield potential in that window, right? Fairly large window. So many times if we're planting from, late September all the way to early November in south central Kansas, north central Oklahoma, or even south from there, we might still be able to reach the same yield potential because the fall is not as cold. It doesn't get as cold as quickly as in other parts of the state. So right there, it brings a lot of flexibility in the farm for us to try to reach a good stand establishment, right? So for us to, things are very dry, I don't want to put out my seed yet. I have still some time, right? Perhaps have some flexibility there on the farm where you're not losing necessarily your yield potential. And it was interesting because just this last year, right, of the harvest of 2024, we had some trials in McPherson actually where that happened. The farmer was able to plant on time around October 15th or so, and we were planting in other parts of the state. We couldn't get there on time. We got kind of rained out, and then we had some international conference to attend to. And so by the time we were able to plant that crop, it was about November 10th or so. In our trials, were 54 bushels per acre, and the farmer average in that field was 53. And
wow.
So it was right there, same thing, right? And so there was one example where we had an open fall that still allowed for good tillering, right? In that region, that we didn't have a steep decrease in yield potential because of planting 3 weeks later, right? So again, that flexibility, as long as we have enough canopy for that critical period later on, we have a lot of flexibility on planting time. And sometimes planting too early can hurt our yields, of course, right? Too much growth, the crop's going to use more water. And planting late can also hurt our yields sometime, right? If we don't have enough tillering out there. But for the most part, again, south central Kansas and going south, the planting window is quite a bit wide compared to other crops. And so again, bringing that flexibility to the farm.
It's really striking. I think when you hear it, the 50 to 60 day planting window, it's quite phenomenal, really, when you say it out loud. And in instances like this fall, that gives you an opportunity to wait on rain, which unfortunately is what we're doing, but also that opportunity to go in after harvested soybeans and things like that. So, well, that broad planting window, especially southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma, as you say, does obviously lend to the dual purpose of wheat for grazing and animal production.
Yes, and that is absolutely another one of the flexibility that it brings to the table, right? Whenever we think of, now just as a curiosity, right? Growing up in Brazil, where we grew spring wheat, I never heard about grazing wheat before. And getting here to the U.S., whenever I went to Oklahoma State, right, of all places in terms of grazing wheat, right, 50, 60% of the area down there is grazed. That was surprising to me. How could those farmers put cattle out in the wheat pastures and graze that out and still harvest later on? That was very surprising. So it kind of got me interested in learning a little bit more about that too. And that's another thing that brings the flexibility on the farm, right? The possibility to graze. So what happens there? Again, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but again, it goes back to as long as you have enough canopy during that critical period later in the spring, we should be in good shape, right? And that's what all the dual purpose research that has been done in Oklahoma and parts of Kansas in the past shows us. It's a crop that if you plant early, it will produce a large amount of forage in the fall. I know that some of those trials in Oklahoma, they have measured up to about close to 4 tons of dry matter forage per acre in the fall, like measured in about December or so. Here in Kansas, we measured up to close to 3, not quite as much, but again, probably don't have as much temperature accumulation in the fall, right? But still, 3 to 4 tons of dry matter forage per acre, that's a lot.
Yes.
And especially in a time of the year when we just don't have other forages.
Right.
Right. And that's a very high quality forage too. We're talking 20-30% crude protein, less than 45% neutral detergent fiber. So again, all things that make it a very high quality forage, and offering as many as 90, 100, 120 days of grazing window there through fall and winter and early spring, right? So that's really bringing another level of flexibility to the farm, which is maybe more on the strategic side, right? We're thinking across years here. You bring that you need to plan on to have cattle, of course, right? On a wheat pasture, stocking rates of up to 250 to about 600 pounds of animal per acre in the fall. And then if you're grazing out, right, 500 to over 1,000 pounds of animal per acre in the spring. So that's quite a bit of grazing potential out there, with potential stocker gains of 1.5 to about 2.5 pounds per day. So a lot of potential for gaining beef weight there. But most interestingly, we're talking about the wheat phase here, right? In the flexibility that it brings is that as long as it is well managed, the grazing, you can still remove cattle by first hollow stem with very limited penalty in the yield, even after gaining all of those pounds we just talked about in beef, due to that high quality forage. There's been some long-term research done, New Marshall in Oklahoma there, for over 20 years now that they have of data, almost 20 years of data, and they show that on average, and these are truly grazed, right? These are like they fence out a variety trial that is not grazed, that is planted on the optimal time, and outside they have an early planted variety trial. All the varieties are there that is grazed by cattle, not simulated grazing. And over the years, they saw a difference of about 15%. It's like about 6 bushels per acre or so between the grazed and the non-grazed, right? That's about 15%. Out of those 15%, about 7% of them they assign to early planting, and the other 7% or so they assign to the grazing stress that the cows bring to the crop, right? Perhaps foliage removal of some plants here and there, trampling of some of the plants as well. So just different types of stresses that the cattle will bring to the wheat crop. But again, we're thinking about gaining all these beef gains, right? And still only losing about 10-15% of our yield potential, still harvesting a grain later on. So it really brings a lot of that flexibility to the table. And it's interesting, again, as I mentioned, it is something that is very particular to this region of the world, right? Other parts of the world where they grow winter wheat may not be able to benefit from that if they have very cold winters, right? Because the winters don't allow maybe the crop to keep growing if it is very cold and very well defined. But if you think of South Central, Southwest Kansas, going into Oklahoma, Texas, and so on, the winters are fairly mild, and so it still allows the crop to continue growing through the winter and producing that forage. But again, for us to have fairly small yield penalty, we need to manage that grazing well, which is not overgraze, ensuring that you have maybe at least about 50% still green cover there when you're terminating grazing, and terminate that at a good time at about that first hollow stem. Again, so we're not removing the heads that are developing down there, only removing the foliage. But again, talking about flexibility to the cropping system, definitely that is something that you cannot do with summer crops.
And cows put a little bit of nitrogen back into that system. A little segue here to talk about the flexibility that we have with winter wheat in nitrogen timing too.
Absolutely. So thinking about flexibility again, it all comes down to timing, right? When do we need to be doing things to that crop? And again, because we have all of that time between planting time, put September, October there, all the way until we start to develop those heads, right? And so first hollow stem through jointing, we have 6 months of time out there when we have opportunity to do some different managements to that crop, and one of them is nitrogen management. So one thing there is we absolutely want that nitrogen to be in the root zone by the time crop really takes on spring growth, right? That's jointing, second node, all the way to heading and so on. So let's take that out of the way first. We're going to make sure that nitrogen is in the root zone by then. But in a fairly dry region where we are, a couple of things to keep in mind is, again, one, making sure that after we apply the nitrogen, there's rain to come and put the nitrogen in the root zone. But 2, I wouldn't be too concerned of going too early there, because unless we have a very wet winter, which is not typically the case here, our potential for losses there, they're not too large, right? So again, we do have that entire flexibility. We want to be closer to when the crop takes on spring growth to avoid major losses. But if you're in a very dry region in the western part of Kansas or eastern Colorado, and you need to make sure that you're just before a rain, you can still have that flexibility in terms of timing and minimizing our nitrogen losses. Now, one question that we always get is, how late can we apply that nitrogen, right? Because you don't want to, if you're too early and it turns out to be a wet fall, wet winter, you can lose some of the nitrogen and reduce your nitrogen use efficiency on that system. So if you want to be close to that first hollow stem time or green up time, another question there is, okay, how late can we apply the nitrogen and still not having a yield penalty? When we talk about that, there's a very, very neat study that was done by Brian Arnau down in Oklahoma State. And essentially, he was looking at the potential for nitrogen recovery, right? So once you see a deficiency in the crop, can the crop still recover from that nitrogen deficiency? And that, to some extent, answers our question of how late can we apply. And what they've done there is essentially they went out in the fall in many different fields across the state, and they had a zero nitrogen control where they didn't apply any nitrogen, and side by side, that planting or before planting, they had a 90 pounds high nitrogen control. So they had 2 controls, one with 0N, one with the high nitrogen out there, and they went back there every week and they were measuring NDVI and measuring the greenness of those canopies, those 2 canopies, the 0N and the high nitrogen. And they kept measuring that. By the time they started finding differences in greenness, right? So by the time they say, okay, well, where we applied nitrogen is greener, right? There's more biomass here than where we didn't. Then they started applying different treatments on neighboring strips, right? So, okay, well, we identified the nitrogen deficiency today, so that's a third treatment that they put out on the side, is at the day when they saw deficiency. And then 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, and so on, right? So all the way to about, I believe, 63 days later, they went. So think about this. You had visible nitrogen deficiency in that crop for 60 days. Mm-hmm. When the time they come back and they put out nitrogen.
Quite a long time.
2 months, right? That's a lot of time. It's a very long window. And looking at their data, it's very interesting because all of those treatments, the ones that you're seeing deficiency, regardless of how long you're seeing the deficiency for, they were out yielding the fall applied nitrogen in about 20%.
Wow.
As long as the nitrogen was in the root zone by jointing, right?
Yeah.
So again, it didn't matter how long you were seeing the deficiency. Maybe you're seeing the deficiency for 60 days if they started seeing the deficiency in the fall. But as long as they put that nitrogen by jointing in the root zone, so again, they put the nitrogen late, but as long as there was rainfall to make it in the root zone by jointing time, they were still better off, a good 20% better off than that fall applied nitrogen. So again, that's such a wide window of opportunity that we have to time our nitrogen right. Of course, there's other things to consider. You don't apply nitrogen on a frozen ground and then it rain on top and things like this. But still, if you get this 6 months window that we have and you take maybe a couple of months where the ground is truly going to be frozen, still leaves with you with 3-4 months of opportunity to get that nitrogen in the root zone before the crop actually needs it. So a huge opportunity there for timing our nitrogen right and ensuring that we have a good nitrogen use efficiency in the farm, because that efficiency is return on your investment, right? The more nitrogen goes into the crop, the less nitrogen you're losing in terms of economic and also to the environment.
And that long application period, not to mention the other economic side of it, is maybe you can take advantage of a break in the fertilizer market. Maybe the price will come down at some point during that time too, and a little bit of savings there.
Absolutely. So there are many things that a grower is thinking about there, right? That perhaps on the research side we're not thinking as often, but also brings a benefit to the wheat out there. So again, very wide opportunity to put out that nitrogen and still get a very good response in that nitrogen, even after we're seeing the deficiency. Again, as long as the nitrogen was in the root zone by about jointing. If you're going past jointing, then they notice something that we kind of already know, but it's good that they put some numbers to it. Then we're not benefiting yields as much. We are benefiting protein, right? So we're bringing a higher protein crop for putting the nitrogen later. But since most of our growers in this region are paid for yield, right, that's the main thing that we need our main benchmark there. So again, as long as that was in the root zone by jointing, didn't matter when we saw the deficiency, it still out-yielded, putting everything out in the fall.
Yeah, that's a great explanation or example there of some versatility. One thing we certainly can't overlook is especially here in the central United States, is the value of the straw, the versatility of the use of the straw from the winter wheat plant, either by removing that straw or leaving it for soil cover. But I think one thing that maybe is also unique to this part of the world is the timing of our harvest with winter wheat allows us to do some double cropping right behind the combine too.
Absolutely. So those are other things that we go into, right, in that chapter, is like the value of that residue being left behind, right, whether it is through weed control or moisture conservation. Also a timely planting of double cropping, right? Whether it is double cropping wheat after a previous full season soybean crop, or even the other way around, right? Double cropping soybean after a previous wheat crop. And then there are things that we can plan around and optimize our cropping system there. So for example, you're going to try to plant a double crop soybeans after wheat, maybe working with a shorter season variety so you can get harvest done perhaps a week or 10 days earlier. That's a lot of yield potential that you're gaining on the soybeans there. Again, coming back to that yield as function of planting date, reducing linearly on the summer crops. Again, if you gain 10 days there, that's greater yield potential that you have through working with a shorter season wheat variety, harvest a little bit earlier to allow you to go with soybeans, or the other way around as well, right? If you're going with full season beans and that is going to be harvested sometime mid-October or so, you can still come back with a double season or a double crop wheat. There are a few things that we look for there, right? Of course, a variety of a good tillering potential, and a variety that also doesn't rely necessarily only on fall formed tillers, but also can tiller out in the spring and still produce good yield from those spring formed tillers. And a few management adjustments that we need in that case too: higher seeding rates, putting in season fertilizer with that wheat seed to really boost that fall growth and fall tillering. But yes, more flexibility to the system, right? Perhaps trying to grow more than 3 crops in 2 years or something along these lines instead of one crop per year. So more flexibility that the wheat brings to the system as well in terms of when we're planting and harvesting those crops.
So Romulo, as we wrap up here, just summarize for us the versatility, the flexibility of winter wheat and what that gives options to the wheat farmer.
Yeah. So summarizing what we talked about today in terms of flexibility of the crop that it brings to our farm, right? I think that many times as farmers we have challenges that we need to tackle every year and many times every few days, right? And here, what the wheat brings to the system is more time to make those decisions, right? And that really can be money as well. As you mentioned, perhaps more timely purchasing of inputs or things along these lines. But really on the farm, some of the flexibility that wheat brings, they all come back to the short season that we have for yield determination as compared to the very long season that the crop has out there. So a lot of vegetative growth, right, from planting there in the fall all the way until about jointing or so. And that large window where the crop may be growing, but it's not necessarily contributing to the yield potential of the crop, is what brings the versatility of the crop. So again, that brings a wide planting window, right, an wide optimal sowing window, because again, as long as we have enough canopy there by jointing, we still should be good. So we can plant either early or late and still many parts of the region still obtain optimal yields. That window also brings versatility in terms of being able to for animal production, because again, we can plant early, produce a lot of forage, graze that crop, and still have enough canopy by jointing that we're not hurting our yields. So that dual purpose system, right, that's very typical in this region here. Versatility in timing of our nitrogen fertilization. Again, we have such a wide window when we can be putting out our nitrogen that we can actually try to time it with rainfall events, so it is in the root zone at the appropriate timing. Again, with all that research showing that as long as the nitrogen is in the root zone by jointing, even if we're seeing nitrogen deficiency early on, it can still recover and still yield even more than a fall applied nitrogen. So again, bringing a lot of flexibility in terms of operations in the farm for when we're putting out that nitrogen. And then of course, the versatility of being a winter crop, rather than a summer crop, and how we can fit that to intensify our systems. Instead of producing one crop per year, perhaps shooting for 3 crops every 2 years by adding that winter wheat there, either as a double crop or again double crop in a soybean after our winter wheat. So I think that those kind of summarize the type of flexibilities that we talked about here today. Again, wide optimal sowing window, possibility for animal production or dual purpose there, timing in terms of nitrogen fertilization, and also the possibility of having a double crop wheat or a double crop soybeans there after our wheat crop.
Well, great summary there. And so that will be the goal of our Wheat Beyond the Value of the Grain campaign. We're going to dive deeper into some of these things and illustrate it. And so over the next few months, stay tuned to Kansas Wheat and K-State social media channels. And we plan on doing some radio, social media, videos, a lot of information over the next several months. And Romulo, we do have a WheatRx webpage, a new WheatRx page that's under development, and tell us what that website is and when we can expect that.
So we're trying to bring all of this information to growers, as you mentioned, through different venues, right? And one of them is a new web page. It's kswheatrx.com. So again, that's kswheatrx.com. And in that page, growers will be able to find, not only growers, but anybody will be able to find the different research projects that we have ongoing, different publications, either research ones or extension ones as well, and just all of this information that we're discussing about Beyond the Grain. It's going to be all made available in that Kansas WheatRx website. We should be on air sometime over the winter.
Great. Thank you, Romulo.
Thank you, Aaron. It's great being here today.
My thanks to Romulo Lollato for joining me on this episode of the podcast. Remember, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. And to learn more about what we talked about on this episode, be sure to visit the WheatRx website at kswheatrx.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.